Good morning, everyone. I guess good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Good time zone if you're anywhere else. I'm not good at knowing what the difference is. Today we are going to be joined by Julia Armfield, who I'm just about to invite into the chat. We're going to be talking about Private Rites, which is her new novel, which is our March book club pick. We're going to be chatting about that on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. So if you want to join us for that, make sure that you sign up for notifications at the link in our bio. That way you get reminded and you'll get the Zoom link on Friday. Very, very excited to talk about this one. I'm a huge Shakespeare nerd, and I loved Our Wives Under the Sea, so I was stoked to see Private Rites. And so I'm going to go ahead and add Julia. Maybe, if Instagram does what it's supposed to do. Oh, it's working.
Huh?
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
I can,
Excellent.
wonderful.
It's so nice to meet you. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So, as I was saying, I was super, super stoked to see the announcement for Private Rites, and then, of course, to get a copy when it hit shelves. I am a huge Shakespeare nerd. I have a portrait tattoo of Shakespeare. And so I was stoked to see specifically like a queer horror retelling of King Lear,
Mhm.
because I think that's such a cool take on it. And so today we're going to talk about your book, and I'm super excited about it. So to get started, I actually have some questions from our community, which I think we're going to jump into. So our founder, Kay, who is also a self-declared Shakespeare nerd, was actually wondering, why did you choose Lear specifically?
No, it's a great question. It's interesting. Something I found so fascinating, just in terms of the book being coming out in the UK first and then coming out in the US, is the US has gone like really hard on advertising it as like to do with Shakespeare, whereas the UK
Yeah,
doesn't really care. So I think you guys are just like more cultural than we are. I think you care about it more, which I think is really nice. But the main thing for me wasn't so much that I started out with the idea of Lear. I think I started out with the idea of siblings, and I wanted to talk about siblings. I wanted to talk about sisters and a father, and I think that it's a poor sort of writer who doesn't at least pay attention to their literary antecedents, if you know what I mean. I
sure.
think it was quite obvious, if you're talking about three sisters and a father, that you are in conversation with Lear in some way, kind of whether you want to be or not. And so it became quite evident to me quite early on that I was going to have to think about what Lear is about to me. And to me, Lear is about inheritance, and Lear is about abuse. And those are two things which I'm very intimately concerned with in this novel. But I think as well, I'm not, and I've absolutely no shade to people who are, but I'm not particularly interested in retelling. I'm not particularly interested in reclaiming. I was more interested in the way that flipping a telescope around in this novel kind of brought me to a different place, because Lear is a story about three sisters and a father, but it's a story where the father is basically never
Right.
off stage. And comparatively speaking, again, it's not that I wanted to reclaim the characters. The sisters in Private Rites are their own characters, but I did think it was very interesting what happened to the story of a family when the sisters were never off stage and the father is not actually
Yeah.
there on stage, on screen, anything for the entire length of the book. And so, again, it wasn't particularly to do with retelling, but it was to do with what happened to storytelling when the focus was shifted, I think.
Mhm. I love that. I think that's super interesting. And I especially love how it's set in this like very post-apocalyptic situation where like the waters are rising, people are becoming increasingly desperate, but then you also have this component where people are also just very much trying to live their lives, whatever that looks like for them, because they feel like they're
Yeah.
running out of time. This is not a community question, so I'm gonna go back to those. But for you, like what was the importance of like playing with that theme of like time and like how people were using it within this
Oh,
context?
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's a novel which is about like late stage capitalism as well
Sure.
as about climate downturn. It's very centrally to me a novel about the way that we all react and have to react to emergency in the system that we are all trapped in. Because
Mhm.
something terrible is going on, obviously, in this novel, but everybody has to make rent. And that's
Right.
much more pressing. And everybody has to go to work, and that's more pressing. And I was very interested in the way that I think, and to be honest, predict that at whatever point things get worse, it will all get worse in a way that will still facilitate us commuting. It will still facilitate us going to work, because there's the quote that everybody knows, but that it is, it is easier to, it's easier to imagine the end of almost everything, but not the end of
Yeah.
capitalism. And I think that was something I was thinking about a lot, the way that people's time is utilized wrongly because it's impossible to react to emergency. And that is, yeah, that was a really, really central thing for me when writing this book.
Yeah, I love that. And I especially appreciate like the contrast and also the comparison sort of between like the the horror of mundanity in the face of the horror of like
Mm.
the end
Mm.
and sort of
Yes,
what
and the
people
fact that
think about.
mundanity is more
Yeah.
insidious almost, you know what I mean? Because it's sort of, it really, it shows up these mazes that we are all trapped in. And it was something that I think about quite a lot, both with this book and with my previous novel, Our Wives Under the Sea. I'm very interested in the sort of insidious nature of dailiness and the way that people often rush to consider the way that people just get on with things as being a positive trait, being a trait about adaptability, but it's also a trait of apathy, and it's also a trait of trappedness. And yeah, I find it really
Yeah,
interesting.
I love that. So another question from one of our community members, user Daily Atkinson, said, I'd love to know what the inspiration was behind the character Jude, and said they're currently my favorite favorite book character of all time.
Oh, that's great. I love that. The inspiration of Jude was what if there was a sexy heartthrob, to be honest. That was mainly
Love
what I
that.
wanted. I think it was very important to me to have both Jude and Stephanie as interrupting voices kind of
Mhm.
halfway through the book, which is something I couldn't entirely decide whether to do initially. And then I read a novel which I really recommend called Greta and Valden, which is by a
I
New
love that
Zealand
book.
writer. It's so good.
It's so
It's so good.
good. Hmm.
It's so good. And there's a bit right in the middle where all of a sudden you get the voice of the older brother, which you haven't
Yeah.
had up until this
Yep.
point. And it's both such a breath of fresh air, but it's also a really, really interesting way of highlighting how trapped you've been in these rather myopic voices.
Hmm.
Because Irene and Isla and Agnes in this novel, whilst they are all unquestionably characters who have been through really terrible abuse, they are also figures of great privilege.
Hmm.
And they are both in a position where they can afford to think about the things that they are thinking about. And so it was important to me to have Jude and Stephanie as characters who I think are somewhat more bedded down in the real world. They come from different classes. Jude in particular is very like it works in social
Yeah.
housing and social care. And those are the things which I think even sympathetic characters of privilege cannot really comprehend in an emergency situation. But something I found really interesting is depending on the interviewer, people have often been like, so what was your thinking in including a non-binary character, thinking that I in some way have some great tract to impart about that? And it's like, Jude's non-binary because Jude is non-binary, that's the point.
Right.
And it doesn't, do you know what I mean? It
Yeah.
feels like people like to assume, even people sympathetically like to assume that I'm saying something, and I'm saying that Jude is non-binary. That is what that character is,
Right.
and it's interesting the way that different readers will react to that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
That makes a lot of sense to me. I loved both Jude and Stephanie, and I also felt like they brought a real sense of perspective to the
Hmm,
book.
I hope so.
Because I had a similar, like, not issue, but like I had a similar kind of like, oh yes, okay, like these people come from incredible wealth. Like these people come from like their father is so incredibly well known. And so they're sort of incredibly well known as like a extension of that sort of. And so they come from this place of like, oh, well, like if the floods keep rising, the house is just going to raise and that's fine.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was very interesting to see how they interact with sort of like the real world insofar as these people that they interact with and have affection for.
Mm,
um
yeah.
so from user steampunk Finn said, I noticed both of your novels talk about websites where people will role play weird things. Do you actually come across these types of websites in your life, and how are they interesting to you?
Oh man. Unfortunately, this just comes from being a certain age and having been on the internet. Do you know what I mean?
The Wild West
Like when
days of
you
the internet.
Yes, the Wild West days of the internet, indeed. Being of an age where you went directly from like LiveJournal to Twitter without the
Oh,
Tumblr blop
yep.
is it's quite a disturbing age to be.
Hmm.
But it's honestly it's something that I do because I enjoy it, which is not always the case when, a lot of the time writing is not a dutiful act, but writing kind of like writing follows on from writing. Whereas the message boards are something I do because they're fun and because I enjoy the voice so much. And also because I enjoy the weird self-policing that always happens, the weird hierarchical nature of it, the way some people will appoint themselves site cop. It's all this tiny little microcosm
Hmm.
of terrible, terrible impulses that I'm often really interested in. So yeah, and of course also I suppose the internet as a kind of fantasy space, which I mean, the more I think about it, is kind of an overly optimistic way of looking at things now. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it used to be that way, but I think it is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah. Capitalism creeps into all
everywhere
things eventually.
it does.
Hmm. Okay, and then our final community question, at least as of right now, which everybody that is watching, thank you for joining us. Feel free to pop questions into the little question bubble down below, or just pop them into chat, and I'll catch them if I catch them. So I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce this person's username. I think it's Weirnix area, maybe, said, I love everything you write, including your Substack, and I love how your characters seem so real and whole. To what extent do you draw on your day-to-day life and encounters to shape these characters and their quirks?
Oh, that's interesting. It's a really good question. I think on and off in some ways. I suppose what I find very interesting, again, dependent on audience, is a version of this question which you have not asked, which is why are your characters queer? Do you think that you will ever write straight characters? And it's a fascinating question because you wouldn't ask that of straight people. And so I suppose a version of the answer to your question as well is that I write the things that I know because I wouldn't be any good at writing the other things. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And I don't mean that in terms of, I've never, been a submarine pilot. I've never lived at the end of the world. But I do know horrible, horrible queer, horrible queer into politics, and I know the terrible ways that I behave, and I know the terrible ways that I feel about there's a thing that comes up in almost every single one of my novels about how there will always be some character who's like, I wish I hadn't introduced these two people to one another because now they like each other more than me, and that's me down to a T. That is exactly the way I feel about everything. And so I suppose a roundabout way of answering your question is that it's fewer writers than you would think have a very broad repertoire, because I do tend to find that most writers are writing about the same 4 or 5 preoccupations over and over again, because that is just the way that we find that we have to get it out. And I'm not actually, for all that I write for all that I write genre, for all that I'm fairly interested in world building, I'm actually much more interested in the boring things that people feel.
Mm.
And I think genre allows me that space to talk about tedious interpersonal politics a lot of the time. So yeah, I guess I am always dragging off myself and my community most of the time.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I'm a person who, like, I always tell people that I don't care about plot, which is not 100% true. Uh, but I'm always much more concerned with like how characters are interacting, how characters are changing, like what they're experiencing internally, than I am with like external pressures.
Yeah.
Because I think that the external pressures can sometimes be a little bit too much. Like I'm less concerned with like that, if that makes sense. So
No, you're
I really
completely right.
yeah, so I really appreciate that about both of your books, because there's very much a sense of like the interiority is kind of the point, even though there's so much going on
Exactly.
outside.
And I think that something, when I'm teaching writing, which I do occasionally, the key thing that I always end up saying is that your characters have to be the point, because you never want to get yourself into a situation, even with a very plot heavy novel, where someone suddenly makes an enormous face heel turn because the plot
Right.
requires it. And you can always tell when a writer's boxed themselves into a space where something has to happen. And so someone has to do something absolutely against all logic and their own personality to make that
Mhm.
happen. And I think that if you spend the time at least getting to know your characters, then you will find your way around problems like that much more.
What does that process look like for you of like getting to know your characters?
Um, I think it's to do for me with mainly I don't do an enormous amount of say like writing exercises, which I know are very, very helpful to some people, but
Right.
I think for me it's following the rolling logic of how a person would react always. There's nothing I hate more in the entire world than when someone is like, oh yeah, my characters, they just like walk into my head and they tell me what to do because I'm like, okay, like you made them up.
Right.
But at the same time, I do but at the same, I do think that it's valuable to me to bring a character to a certain point and then actually sit with how everything I know about them informs what goes forward, because then that thing will kind of inform the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And that's why I quite like working between different character voices as well, because the second that I swap from one voice to another is usually when I can tell that a character has come to a crux point and that I need to move. So yeah.
I love that. That makes sense. And so in terms of like theming across both of your novels, Private Rites and also Our Wives Under the Sea, water is obviously a major theme. You know, you've got this
Yes.
underwater mission that goes horribly awry, and then you've also got these rising water levels in this city that's desperately trying to stay atop the flood. What about the ocean specifically like calls to you as a writer?
So I've been asked this question a lot, obviously, because it's very, very obvious. And you are completely right. I think that when I was sort of being asked about this, obviously more when this book came out, and so it kind of made me think about where it was that came from. And it occurred to me that there was like an enormous amount of kind of formative lesbian media for me, which weirdly kind of circulates around water, around rain, around the sea. You think about things like the Sarah Waters novels, which aren't necessarily about water, but the early ones are all set in Whitstable,
Yeah,
which is right by the sea. You have the Celine Sciamma movie, you've got like Water Lilies, which is about synchronized swimming, and you've got Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is set by the ocean again. Even you guys probably won't get this reference, but there's a really problematic text of a TV show in the UK called Sugar Rush, which I don't recommend. But at the same time, if
okay,
you were like a lesbian when you were 16, you probably watched it, and that was set
gotcha.
by the sea as well. And so I think to a certain degree, the thing that you inhale is the thing that you will eventually exhale. But then I kind of started thinking about, well, what is water as a tool doing for me in my writing? And I think, to be completely honest, that it just works as a very valuable symbol for the things that I'm trying to get across. Because the things I'm interested in instability, I'm interested in liminality, and I'm interested very particularly in the idea of being one thing on the surface and another thing underneath, which I think is very key to the queer experience as I understand it and I feel it. And so I think that water as a tool really allows me to get those points across. That having been said, if I do it again, I think people are going to be like, "Are you all right?" So, so I think maybe something else for the next one. But yeah.
Yeah, sure. And then as far as like the sort of commentary on capitalism that you explore in both of these, and the commentary on work as sort of that ultimate both like ultimate overlord and also ultimate evil in a lot of ways. I think it's really obvious why that's something that comes into your books, especially, you know, as a queer writer writing about queer characters. But how do you establish the specific stakes of what capitalism is doing in each of your characters' lives?
Oh, wow, I've never been asked that question before. That's so interesting. I think I think a lot of it comes back to your earlier question about time
Mm,
and about attention, because I think that a lot of my characters, and this is true of the project that I'm writing now as well, I think a lot of my characters exist in this quite liminal, squeezed space, not necessarily because everybody is not privileged, because of course the characters from Private Rites are extremely
right.
privileged, but a lot of people exist in this space where what is happening, this often very extraordinary thing that is happening, is operating within these heavy brackets of work and these heavy brackets of the world. And I try not to forget the mundanity of everything, even when I'm writing in kind of high genre. I don't like to hand wave particularly. I like people's dailiness to be evident. And I think so leaning again into, like I said earlier, leaning into the boringness, I think is something which actually really helps me to establish that. I think as well that it's hard as a writer not to feel impacted by that, because capitalism is the greatest it is the greatest barrier to art in many ways. Capitalism has control over my time, the fact that I have to work full time as well as doing this, the fact that I have to pay my rent, the fact that I have to live, the fact that the entire idea of sort of like communality and solidarity is squeezed out of all recognition by capitalism. All of those things make it harder to write. And so it's very hard to not find that, whether subconsciously or consciously, on the page, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then what kind of horror are you drawn to, both as a consumer and then also as a creator? Because like I think it becomes pretty apparent across your body of work, but I'm interested in like the kinds of horror that you maybe haven't like presented to the public yet.
Well, that's a good question. I think, I mean, in the past, it's always been very body horror for me, obviously, which is not something I'm moving away from, but it's simply something which I think I've sort of come to the sort of whole summation of. I don't think that that's something that I can take that much further. I'm more interested, and I think this comes across in Private Rites quite a lot. I'm quite interested in the concept of haunting as being something self-propagated. There's a lot in Private Rites about memory kind of slips back and forth a lot, particularly when they find themselves in the house. I didn't want it to be particularly clear at all points what the timeline was. So they're there in the house, but they are also kind of in their memories, and their memories are not very delineated and all of those things. And I think that a lot of that comes from film for me, because time is a slightly different thing in film. There's a movie which I cannot wholeheartedly recommend because it is about a magic mirror, but I love it so much. There is a movie called Oculus, which is an early Mike Flanagan movie. He went on to do Haunting of Hill House and all that.
I remember Oculus.
I love Oculus so much. It's about this grown-up brother and sister who come back to a house where something terrible happened. And we don't know really whether or not it was the fault of the magic mirror or whether there was a terrible act of parental violence that took place, basically. And the adult actors basically occupy the same soundstage as the child actors for most of the movie, and they walk past themselves, and there is no real delineation between scene shifts. We don't fade from one scene to another. We just turn around as if we're in a play. And that's something I'm really fascinated by, and something that I really wanted to try and recreate in Private Rites.
Well, that's also very Mike Flanagan coded, because that's something that you also see in Hill House, and it's so beautifully done. It's so good.
To say it, everyone's got 3 preoccupations in the world, and if you do it well, you should keep doing it.
This is true, yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions in the chat, which I'm going to throw out real quick. We've got, so Perfect Angel 144 is curious, what do you write your books on?
As in like what program?
Yeah.
Oh God, no! I've got the most vile answer to this question. I write exclusively in Google Docs, which is like the chaotic evil answer to that question. Everyone's like, "Oh yes, I write in this beautiful program that I write on Scrivener or whatever," and I'm like, "I write in Google Docs. I don't know what the word count is." But yeah, I'm afraid that's my answer.
Do you single space your drafts?
I single space my draft. I think they're in something really horrendous like Arial, and then I move them across to Times New Roman in a Word document, and I make them look nice afterwards.
Excellent. Love that. Perfect. And then from user XXLEXXX, what do you do for work when you're not writing?
Oh, it's very boring. I work in legal education.
Okay, cool. And we've also got from Male Blue Mchen, I think. What does your writing process look like? Is it the characters that you envision first, or the themes that you want to cover?
It's always the characters I envision first. I think they often come they often come kind of like hard by the themes, if you know what I mean. Like it's very clear to me quite quickly, but particularly in the case of Private Rites, what I knew I wanted to write about siblings, but more specifically, I really knew that I wanted to write about birth order, actually, because I always say there is,
Oh, okay.
I don't believe in star signs, I don't believe in personality tests, but you tell me your birth order and I know absolutely everything about you. And I hold by that because I think it's true. And so three siblings was a choice I made quite early because I realized that, that's the perfect way to do all three. I can have older and middle and younger. And so, but yeah, it is always characters first and then everything leads from that.
Okay, cool. All right, and then we've got another community question, which is from NR Edwards Writing, I think. How do you feel about using the queer tragedy or bury your gaze trope? Context: I'm writing an essay on Our Wives Under the Sea and the lack of happy endings in queer narratives.
So I feel very strongly about this, actually. I think that there is, I've noticed this quite a lot, and I don't think it's positive or negative, but I've seen a strong push in recent years towards what people will abstrusely call queer joy,
Mm-hmm.
in queer writing and queer film. I think that gets conflated with meaning that people want to see nothing happen and that people want only happy things to happen and that everybody is going to have a coffee and have a relationship and then they're all going to go to bed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's lovely if you like it. But to me, as a person who has never knowingly written a single nice thing happening to any of her characters, queer joy to me is writing stories where the whole grief of the situation is not about being queer.
Mm-hmm.
My characters are not tormented about being queer. My characters are not tormented because of necessarily, that is not the thing which is taking them away from queer joy. They get joy from their queerness, all of my characters. That doesn't mean that they have to have happy endings. And I think that's a very important distinction, because I don't think that we as queer writers, queer artists, queer creators should feel boxed into having to write any one thing. So yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. I think that's a really interesting take on it as well, because I think that there is a tendency to assume that it can only be one thing or the
Yeah,
other, right? Like it can only be
exactly.
good things or bad things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. And then we have another question from Canned Tuna 6. What was the first story you wrote?
Oh God, ever. I've absolutely no idea that my one this is tragically the only thing I've ever wanted to do, and so it would have been some terrible sort of stapled together book of nursery rhymes or something that I wrote when I was tiny, I'm afraid. But yeah, I wasn't any good until about 2017, so it did take a while.
Yeah. I interviewed another author for an article a couple of days ago who said that, when she was 8, she was writing like really epic fantasy novels, or at least what she thought were really epic fantasy novels.
Mm.
And then she rediscovered them a couple of years ago and was like, it was the
Oh,
best day of my
oh
life.
no.
And I was like, yeah, I think that would happen to me as well if I discovered some of the writing that I did
Yeah,
when I was a kid. We have
it
to
do
move
be like
past
that.
it. We can't think about it. Um, User and It's Real would like to know, how different is your first draft from your last? I'm fascinated by the idea of your first draft being like gathering the sand to make sandcastles later.
I like that. In some ways, I'm quite fortunate, I think. I write very steadily and I write entirely chronologically. So I do have to go just
Oh.
from the beginning to the end. I'm very envious and have always been of writers who can kind of like pick the good bits and then weave it all together later, because I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a very different mode of discovery. For me, I know what's going to happen in the end, and I have to just write my way there, and I cannot go out of order. It just doesn't work in my head. And so it means in some ways, to be honest, that I've never had to do a massive structural edit because I've spent such a long time getting there that everything does kind of make
Mm-hmm.
sense. But that having been said, yeah, the role of an editor has always been entirely crucial to me, particularly in terms of pacing, because that form of writing, I think, means that you're so smashed up against it that you really can't see whether things are too fast, too slow, and how things are progressing. And it also means that you do tend to be more overwritten at the beginning, I think. So it's mainly restructured for pace for me.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
I am also a chronological writer,
Really?
and I'm also envious of people who understand how
How?
things fit together
I
out
can't
of order.
do it. It doesn't feel real to me unless I have come to it via the rest of the novel. It's so difficult.
Yeah.
I can't get it down.
Yeah, and I'm the same. Like I know what I want to happen at the end, and I have to get there.
Your vibe there.
Yeah. Okay, Weirnix area has another question for you, which is, as a chronically ill disabled person, I see a lot of myself and my disabled community in some of your characters, especially Leah post coming back wrong.
Mm.
Is this a way that you intend for those themes to be read?
That's such a good question. I think I think it's very important for us as writers to recognize, or for me anyway, to recognize that once something is out of my hands, it's actually really not my responsibility anymore. I think some writers, and it's different for different writers, but I think that some writers can drive themselves mad by attempting to exercise ongoing control over how a novel is read.
Mm,
Whereas to me, I think the most important thing about writing a book is that once it's gone through me, it's yours. And you can read it any which way you like. That having been said, it's also important to me as an able bodied writer to be like, it's very important to me that that can be read that way.
right.
But I also am coming from a position of Leah and Mary are both, or are at the beginning of the novel, are both able-bodied people. They have all of the privilege that that entails. And so I don't want to steal valor, which is not mine. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
But at the same time, it is very much also a parable about caring, and it is a parable about the ways in which society and the infrastructure is not set up to help or to deal with you in any way, and very much tries to not see you. So there are certainly elements of that, but again, I think stealing valor on Julie is would not be fair.
Yeah, fair enough. And then we have from Ren Alderton. Hi, Julia. I love your work. I was wondering how you structure your work. As an aspiring writer whose work is all vibes, no plot, I'd love to hear your advice on crafting a narrative arc and bringing it to fruition while also maintaining impeccable vibes.
Oh, bless you. I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm so sorry. I'm so vibes. And that's important though. I think it's very
Yes.
important to be like, you can be all vibes and you will get there. My only piece of advice on that is try to do what I do at least, which is, if nothing else, know where you're going. You're like your final endpoint, because kind of like bibbling your way through there will probably get you there home safe. But more crucially, try to remember what is actually important to you about the whole project. Because over the course of writing a novel, you're going to become sick of the plot. You're going to become sick of the characters. You're going to become sick of yourself. You're not going to want to deal with any of this. And so the actual deep down single thing at the point of the novel is still going to have to be something that you want to say. Because as long as you want to get something across enough, then you'll be able to force yourself through all the mechanism of actually writing a novel. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I was also wondering this. Double X Ellie Triple X wants to know. They said, I love the sibling dynamic in Private Rites so much. I have two sisters too, and was wondering, do you have sisters yourself? Because it was so realistic.
No, I have a brother, but I am an
Oh,
older sister. And I
okay.
think that is, I think you can tell. Just from, I think it would be fair enough to assume I was an older sister. But yeah, I'm really, there's a line from The Secret History which I really love, which is that I'm an only child, people's siblings interest me. I'm not an only child, but people's siblings absolutely fascinate me.
So that line, so A, The Secret History has haunted me for about a decade since I read it. And B, that line sticks to me because I am an only child.
People's siblings interest you, right?
Yeah. So yeah, and I'm fascinated by them. I have no, both of my partners have younger siblings, and I'm so fascinated by that dynamic because it just is so foreign to me. Like
Mhm.
it just doesn't, and it's so, yeah, it's so strange to me. All right, and then we have from, I think it's Naya Kidanova 866. How early into the writing process do you decide on the ending? And you said that that's where you start, right? So was this always going to be the end of Private Rites, or have there been changes along the way?
Well, that's a very good question. It was the ending, except I'm treading lightly here because I'm aware that not everybody might have read it. But
Yeah, well,
the thing,
spoiler light.
yeah, spoiler alert. All I will say is that that scene was always going to happen. The thing that happens to one of the sisters originally happened to another of the sisters. And it
Oh,
was literally not changed until edits, when my editor was like, well, that's a depressing ending. Why don't we shift that? And she was right. So, yeah.
interesting. Okay.
Hmm.
Based on what you just said, I know which sister it would have happened to originally, and I agree. So I'm glad that it got changed.
Thank you very much. There we go. You see, that's why everyone needs to be edited
Yeah,
desperately.
right. There you go. So, I also agree that like once a book is out in the world, it's no longer really the author's responsibility to like tell the reader how to interpret it. But I am curious, in your heart of hearts, like what do you want your readers to take away from your books?
Um, I want the reader to take away that I think everybody is everybody is capable of paying everybody else some form of grace. I think because they are all books in which terrible things happen. But I don't want to consider any of my work bleak to the point of unsalvageable. I think in every case, I hope that the people who make it through the books alive, I want them to have come to a slightly higher place of grace and understanding and kindness for each other. So yeah.
What have you learned through writing your first two novels?
Um, I've learned that I'm very impatient and irritable, and every single time I finish a novel, that's the last time I will ever successfully finish a novel. And given the fact that I have now done it twice, that would seem to be untrue, but it is true. No, 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 can't do it. Can't do it anymore. That's the thing I've learned.
Okay, so that leads perfectly to my next question, which is, can you tell us anything about what you're working on next?
Yeah, you can't
Not a
do it.
novel. Great.
Yeah, no, I'm writing about mountaineering in the 1990s and bad gays and ghosts.
Ooh, are there Subarus? There must be Subarus, right? Mountaineering in the 1990s. I feel like that's
Only that, yeah.
necessary. Excellent. Okay, great. Okay, well, great. So that's kind of my list of formal questions. If anybody in the chat has any like last minute things that they want to throw out, feel free. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. This was so great. Everybody, just as a reminder, Private Rites, Julie Armfield, it's great. And it is our book club pick for March. If you haven't read it already, but you've got, a couple of days to just like speed through it, which I think you can do, we are meeting and talking about it on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and that'll be over Zoom. So we will be meeting and talking about the book and talking about horror and queerness and the flood, which will be great. And I'm very excited about it. So
I hope you enjoy.
yeah, I think it'll be fun. I actually laughed because in the back of the finished copy, there's a little thing that's like suggestions for your next book club. And like, oh no, we're already there. We're doing it. It's happening.
On top of that.
Okay, for our final question, we've got one more from Ellie, which is, do you have tips on establishing a writing routine?
Oh, bless you. I mean, my writing routine is a disaster because I work full time, but in some ways, I suppose I am the right person to ask that question of, which is that try to be kind to yourself. Usually what I would say is that if I've written 500 words, I've done well. If I've written 1,000 words, I've done excellently. And until I'm in a sprint, I really don't write more than that. It will get done. You just have to keep chipping it. And also I would say, please God, try to stop going back and fixing it, because that is the thing that stymies 90% of the people I see who've been writing a novel for 2 years. You just have to get to the end of it, because even if you go over and over and over and you edit and edit and edit as you go, when you sell it and when it gets edited, people are going to rip it to pieces and you're going to have to write it again. So there is no point getting it to a point where you think it's absolutely perfect, because it's not, because you need other eyes on it. So just get to the end of it. It's not a helpful question exactly on routine, but try not to bash yourself so much as you go along, because that will be somebody else's job later.
I think that's really great advice. And that's that person's job security, is being able to rip apart someone else's book. That's the whole thing.
Exactly.
That's
so actually you're contributing to the economy. There you go.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope you have an excellent rest of your week. Best of luck on your next project. Can't wait to read it. And thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.